just to kick things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about trust because, as Rebecca said, this is what's bringing us together to start things off. Kathy emphasized that that's a real focus of the ways in which, for example, Salesforce has been approaching things. But this is, trust is one of those words that gets used all the time. If we go back even to, say, 2019, we see executive orders coming out of the first Trump administration, which is now 6 years ago, about trustworthy AI. We were seeing trust used as language by various partners of PAI and by parts of the tech industry dating back to 2015 at least. And one of the challenges we have is understanding what do we really mean when we talk about trust? Because very often that gets operationalized as, I can convince people to use it. But that's not trust. I can be convinced to do a lot of things. That doesn't mean that I trust those things. Trust is not merely my willingness to use. It's not merely my ignorance of how the system actually works. I go, sure, I'll trust that bungee jump. It's much more about thinking about what it is that we are delegating when we trust someone or something. Like let's start with the someone here. When I trust someone, when I trust my wife with our daughter's health, when I trust my bank to take care of my money, what I'm doing is I'm saying, here's something that matters to me. Here's something that's precious, that's valuable. And what I want to do is I want you to take care of it the way I would take care of it if I were there, or if I had your resources, or if I had your ability. And this way of thinking about trust, that fundamentally trust is about our values, to use the philosophical language. I know value sounds like a very generic term. Philosophers, we have to make everything technical. And so for a philosopher, the notion of value is a very technical notion. It has to do with what matters to you. What you are willing to do is evidence of your values, but it does not constitute the values. You have many values. You have values because of the roles you have. I have certain values because I'm a parent, certain values because I'm a professor, certain values because I live here in the US. And those values can, of course, come into conflict. That's part of what makes life difficult. That's really the source of almost all ethical dilemmas, is exactly this question of what is it we value, how should we act given that our values conflict with one another at times. And if we think about trust in terms of values, we can see it as trust involves delegating, making yourself vulnerable to someone or something else because you are entrusting a value to them. You're asking them to take care of you. Now, in the present day, we don't necessarily talk about things that way when we talk about trustworthy AI agents. We tend to talk about things in terms of something like, say, value alignment. That's maybe a term that is going to be familiar to, I'm going to guess, every single person in this room. And we sometimes go, value alignment, what does that mean? Well, value alignment, fundamentally at its core, is about being able to trust something. If my values are aligned with my wife's, with regards to our daughter's health, then I can trust that she will make decisions that conform with my values. When my values are aligned with my bank with regards to my financial resources, I can trust that they're not going to go, down to Vegas and blow all of my retirement income at the craps tables. And so the language of value alignment really is not quite a synonym, but pretty close to that when it comes to trust. And so when we think about building trustworthy AI systems, when we think about being able to trust the technologies that we're building, I think a lot of that can be understood in terms of how do we make sure that the values of the systems that we're building align with the values of the people who are going to be using them, who are going to be affected by them, who should have a voice in what happens with them. And if we look at what has been developed in terms of frameworks, practices, policies, guidance for building trustworthy AI systems, for building value-aligned systems, we can exactly see that this is what people are being told to do. You go out, you engage with the relevant stakeholders, you find out what values matter to them, you find out what they care about, what are the problems they're trying to solve, and then you make sure that your technology addresses those issues, supports their needs, understands that they might think a false positive is much better than a false negative. So you find the right point on the ROC curve, right? Even at the simplest level, where values enter into those kinds of things. So that's what we've been building as a community. And many people in this room have contributed far more to that even than I have. This idea that what we really need to do is we need to be able to get our technology to line up with the values of the stakeholders. And I want to suggest that that way that we are all actually, or many people in this room, are sort of used to thinking about value alignment and trust, actually applies to our institutions. We are entering a world, or we have entered a world, in which institutions are dramatically less trusted than they used to be. The government is less trusted than it used to be. Even parts like the military that have historically been very highly trusted, here, at least here in the United States, are no longer trusted in the same way. The press is not trusted in the same way. I'm guessing at least some of you in this room who work in the tech industry have heard from people that you are no longer trusted by many people in the world. As an academic, I can tell you absolutely, we are not trusted in the same way even that we were a decade ago, let alone 25 years ago when I was starting my career. Trust is fading all around us. And I think this way of thinking about trust in institutions, much as we think about trust in technology, is useful because we can look and say, why are we no longer trusting institutions around us? Why are we no longer trusting companies? Because we don't see them as supporting our values. We don't see them as actually caring about the things and protecting the things that matter to us. Now, leave aside whether that's true or false, right? I mean, they might actually be protecting it, but because of disinformation, we don't realize that. And it can also help us to see why we can think of this as a loss of trust rather than a kind of active distrust, because loss of trust means I don't know if it will support my values. Distrust is when you think that the technology or the person or the organization is actively working against your values. Right? That's the difference between I just don't know if I should trust you and I'm going to protect myself against you because you're trying to harm me. And so when we think about these things, I think we need to, we have an opportunity, or at least we might hope we have an opportunity, to think not just about building trust in agents, agentic AI, not just building trust in information ecosystems, but thinking about building trust across organizations and all of those kinds of institutions that we are interacting with. In fact, perhaps using the very techniques that we've been developing in AI. I think we often think about, let's see what other fields have done, and then we can port it over into the AI field and be inspired by work on participatory design. That's one salient example of where people have been doing that, human factors. They've been doing this for 75, 100 years. Let's learn from those people here in the AI field. I think we actually have the opportunity to reverse that. That, in fact, things that we have been figuring out in the AI field have the potential to have a much broader impact if we can find ways to engage, educate, and inform people about it. Now, the risk of that, I will say, is, and here I will just do a brief, about 1 minute plug before bringing up the people for the panel, because I know that they are far more who everyone's concerned with. And that is a plug for a giant open problem that I think we're only now starting to recognize. It's something that has been an active focus of my research group. And that is the fact that all the techniques that we're building in the AI field, almost all of them assume that everybody gets along. They all assume that we're fundamentally in a cooperative environment, that I can go out to the different stakeholders and figure out what they want and build a technology that just helps everybody. And maybe there's a little bit of value pluralism, but still everyone gets along. I want you to briefly think about, many of you live here in the Bay Area, so you are acutely familiar with the Waymo vehicles that are everywhere. I feel sort of like they're kind of, I was away from San Francisco for 2 months since my last trip here. I came back and suddenly it's sort of like an infestation. Is that the plural of self-driving cars? Sorry to anyone who works for Waymo in the audience, but it is really noticeable. And here's the question: what is it for a Waymo car to be trusted or trustworthy? Because if I'm a driver or I'm a pedestrian, it is not a fully cooperative endeavor. Driving is not a game of pure cooperation. It's not a zero-sum game either, right? I mean, we have to get along for the roads to work, but yet driving is a quintessential example of what we can think of as a semi-competitive environment. Or think about the financial market. What is it for JP Morgan Chase to have a trustworthy financial agent to do trades for somebody? Well, I mean, on the one hand, a clear stakeholder for somebody like JP Morgan Chase would be, BlackRock or Capital One. But if you think about something like the NIST AI risk management framework, it says go out to all the stakeholders, find out their values, and find out how your tech can support their values. I guarantee you JP Morgan does not want to support the values of BlackRock. But they do want to make sure the financial system doesn't crash. Finance is not actually a zero-sum game, even though lots of people model it that way, because everyone has an interest in the system persisting. And so what we need is we actually, I think, need new ways of thinking about trust that enable us to think about what it is to be trusted in an environment where not everyone gets along. So that's the challenge I put out to all of you, is as we think about trust, don't just think about the easy cases, which are nonetheless very, very hard. But the easy cases where everyone kind of gets along, you're building for one group that doesn't have to interact with others, you're just trying to support them. Start thinking about how we can build trustworthy AI systems, how we can build trustworthy organizations and institutions in a world where we often fight with one another, but yet at the end of the day, we're all trying to get to an approximately similar destination. Because that's the world we actually live in. And that's a world that we don't yet have appropriate tools for. So with that, I'd like to invite the other three panelists up to the stage. And I will pick up the device that has their introductions and some questions, and we'll have a conversation around this. So it's truly an honor to get to share the stage with the three of you, because I have in various ways known about and admired the work of all three of you over the years. Immediately to my left, to your right, is Rebecca Finlay. You've already heard from her, but she is the CEO at Partnership on AI and has had an influential career at the intersection of technology and society, holding leadership roles in civil society, research organizations, and industry. Prior to PAI, she founded and led the AI in Society program at the global research organization CFAR. If you don't know CFAR, I encourage you to learn about it, not just because it's Canadian, but because it has truly been leading the way in multi-stakeholder efforts to build out technology in general and to understand the implications of technology. Rebecca has been featured in books and media, including in Financial Times, The Guardian, Politico, Nature Machine Intelligence, and speaks at venues such as South by Southwest, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many more. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, so has her scientific credentials in order, and sits on advisory bodies in Canada, France, and the US. She lives in Toronto, but I'm sure is here frequently, and holds degrees from McGill and the University of Cambridge. Next to Rebecca is Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and a co-editor-in-chief of the Tech Tank blog and the Tech Tank podcast. Her research focuses on the intersection between technology and social justice, particularly in areas ranging from universal access to communication to design and application of AI models. So you can see why she is uniquely positioned to be able to speak on matters such as AI and trust, especially as it connects not just to technology, but to institutions. In 2023, Turner-Lee developed and launched the AI Equity Lab, which is focused on advancing inclusive, ethical, non-discriminatory, and democratized, small bar there, AI models and systems throughout the US and the global South. She just released her first book, which I'm guessing is there in her lap, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, which advances a roadmap toward a more just digital society and economy. She was recognized in 2022 with the Distinguished Career Award in the practice of sociology by the American Sociological Association, and graduated from Colgate University and has an MA and PhD in sociology from Northwestern. And finally, but certainly not least, Liza Levitt serves as Vice President, Deputy General Counsel of Intuit Incorporated. She's responsible for the legal and compliance strategy for Intuit's platforms and emerging technology, supporting Intuit's mission of powering prosperity around the world. She also leads Intuit's Responsible AI Governance program in close partnership with their technology leaders. She is an advisory board member to the University of San Francisco School of Law's Center for Law, Tech, and Social Good here in the city, and a member of their board of governors. She has a BA from George Washington University and a JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law. So thank you to all three of you for joining up here. So I'd like to start with a question, and Liza, I'm afraid you get this as the furthest away, and we'll work our way back for this one. This is a question for all three of you, which is that, as has been mentioned and as we're all acutely aware, institutions in all sectors are increasingly being less trusted, whether private companies, civil society, nonprofits, all represented up here, academia, all represented on this stage. So as we're seeing this loss of trust and perhaps even the growth of distrust in society, how does that impact how we think about responsible AI, whether from your personal perspective or from your perspective at Intuit?
Sure. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and everybody here. So I think that the concepts still remain the same. So trustworthy AI, AI that is fair, transparent, ethical, protective of privacy, and that there's accountability and oversight still remain the same. I think in a world where there is potentially less trust, there's more opportunity to build it in different ways. And that depending on where you are in that, I'll call it the value chain, there's different ways for you to operate to build that trust, which is so important to adoption, because AI does have a tremendous benefit and can really help people, help society, and there's that really opportunity to use it for good.
So I think this is a really important question, and we just actually released research today at the Brookings Institution on Black women's trust in AI. And a researcher who's a non-resident fellow with us, Raj Korpin, who is at CUNY, basically did a survey about 58 Black women to determine whether or not they would actually use AI if it was presented as a solution for healthcare or financial services, et cetera. And the finding that I have actually been most attached to in the last few weeks is that the lack of trust by Black women of democratic institutions, as well as the structural institutions, actually give some deterrent for them trusting these systems. And so what that suggests to me is that there's this really fine line that we have to continue to explore when we talk about the conversation of trust. One is trust in the technical design of the model, obviously. Another is trust that the technology is going to be optimized for a variety of populations, it's going to do what it says it does. And the third is the ability of the technology to redress or heal this trust that has already been broken externally. And I think that's an area where many AI researchers, and as a sociologist, is very intriguing to myself. How do you actually create that throughput so that people who have been harmed by systemic inequality or external conditions or circumstances, a wrong decision at a doctor's office or perhaps a wrong turn on a street, that they don't know if that information is credibly affirming what their context is, it becomes really difficult for us to have this conversation on trust in a vacuum. So I'll stop there because, people who know me, I can go on and on and on because I'm like an evangelist on this stuff, but I'm not going to do that because we have limited time. But I think that is sort of the way we have to start thinking about trust in safety protocols, but trust and safety in the institutions that are essentially fueling the need or the drive or the interest in that AI technology.
And I would just add, I think what's so important is the understanding that it's coming from a deficit in the first place. And so I knew we were going to talk about trust, so I took an opportunity. I don't recommend this highly, to reread the Edelman Trust Barometer for this year. So, globally, they say 61% of the respondents have moved from distrust of institutions, and by institutions, that's industry, government, media, and academia. So distrust has moved just from distrust to grievance. So there is an active feeling of grievance that institutions are just not serving you effectively, but they're actually working against your interests. And I really think this point about differential impacts is so important because that's bringing so much to bear around trust in institutions. But having said that, and just to wind up, I think that does create a huge opportunity for a company or an institution that chooses to forefront itself as a trusted actor. And what does that mean, and how do you live into that? What is the competitive advantage in this moment of ensuring that trust is core to everything you do, your technology, your governance frameworks and infrastructures, and your products and services?
Well, I want to build on this a little bit, and in particular, starting by building on this idea that you can build trust. And so, Liza, I want to pitch it over to you. What are, from your perspective, maybe 2 or 3 ways that you can think about from a company's perspective? How do you build that trust, especially if it's a company that maybe people haven't engaged with in the past?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to speak, obviously, to the enterprise perspective. So I think there's really 3 big ways in terms of how I think about that. And so one is through building trust through principles and robust governance. The second is by leaning into transparency. And then the third is really about engaging with multiple stakeholders to really understand the problems that they're trying to solve and meet them where they are. And so I'm happy to share a little bit about each of those. And so the first is around what I said was principles and robust governance. And so I know that a lot of enterprises here in the audience today have those if they're working for companies. But those are types of things where principles can help guide an enterprise's decision around how they either use AI, develop, deploy AI for the benefit of their customers or the public. And so principles should include things like trustworthy AI concepts, and I mentioned those earlier, and should really align with that company's or the enterprise's mission and values, and really what it stands for. And just as an example, some of our principles at Intuit are that we use AI to power prosperity, right? We don't use it outside of that mission. Our goal is to power prosperity of small businesses and consumers in their financial lives. And other types of principles are that we build AI that works hand in hand with people to help them do their jobs better. And so those are 2 of our principles, among others that include fairness and transparency, accountability, and those types of things. And then taking those principles and operationalizing those through really robust governance practices. So those are things like your policies, your procedures, your training, your technical controls to help ensure that the principles are operationalized throughout the AI governance, the AI lifecycle, for your enterprise. And so those are 2 big areas, in that first bucket of principles and governance. And that's where frameworks like industry frameworks and best practices can really be helpful, because they provide a common language across many enterprises. If people know that you align with certain frameworks, then that's a common language and understanding that can also help build trust. So that's one big area. I think the second area is leaning into transparency. So that's being really transparent with your stakeholders about those principles and about your practices. And again, that's where frameworks like the NIST AI risk management framework can come into play and give people a better understanding of, well, if I align to that framework, people know what that really means, or it's at least a helpful frame of reference. And being transparent means things like, obviously, like publishing them on your website, including them in your communications, and really operationalizing them in kind of, because trust is earned over time. And showing what you do is very helpful. And then the third big area is really around engaging with your stakeholders, and that depends on the enterprise that you may be involved with. But for us, that means engaging with our customers and deeply understanding the problems that they're trying to solve. And so, just as an example, we learned that small businesses, and that is one of our key customer groups, didn't know how to adopt AI or how it could benefit them, and so we launched a nationwide tour with a nonprofit called Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, which provided free hands-on workshops to small businesses to help them learn how they can adopt AI tools, not just our own, but others that are available and free to them that will help them compete, help them get customers, help them run their business. and answer questions about what responsible use questions were on their mind, which was really interesting. And another way to engage with stakeholders is like what we're doing today with impactful organizations like Partnership on AI that brings together all of us to solve problems that are really important together. And then finally, I'll just add one more. Policymakers are another way to build trust, right? And so engaging with policymakers to help them understand the technology, help them understand the benefits it actually provides their constituents so that they have that context when they're doing their jobs. And also bringing the voice of customers, like, for example, our small businesses, we actually bring them directly to policymakers so that they can hear directly from them around what is most important to them and what will help them succeed, so that they can have that that important context in their mind when they're enacting policies that may be helpful, like being able to provide funds, for example, for them to adopt digital tools that will help them succeed. So those are just some ways. I know there's a lot of other ways, but those are just some.
So I'll add on to it. I echo a lot of what Liza said in terms of what enterprises should be thinking about when they're sort of thinking about self-governance. And I'll go a little deeper on a couple of the points that she made. So when I wrote my book about the digitally invisible, it was really around the digital divide. But as I've talked about the book in the context of AI, it's about the digitally invisible people who do not show up in data sets or do not show up in participatory conversations when we're thinking about the application of AI in really high consequence areas like healthcare or education or financial services. And so one of the things I would say to enterprises is you have to always consider who is digitally invisible at your table. When you are actually in the startup phase and you're thinking through what type of product do I actually want to bring to market, look around the room. And sometimes you'll realize that the digitally invisible people are not just people with different demographics, but they're people with subject matter expertise. We started the AI Equity Lab at Brookings primarily because the people who were talking about AI were just AI experts. They were not community practitioners or people who really understood the lived experiences of what happens when this technology interfaces with those circumstances and contexts. But they also were people who could help companies reduce the reputational and financial risk associated with high liability. I mean, every enterprise does not want to land up on the front page of the newspaper, and that is like the greatest nightmare, but every enterprise also doesn't have a person to tell them you're about to land up on the front page of the newspaper. So you really need to think about how you're contextualizing the formation of your group, your subject matter experts, whether internal or external. The other thing I would say that I think is really important to building trust is you have to have trust in data. So, you know, I love the Partnership on AI. I love Rebecca, our board, the staff that work here, because it constantly keeps me on my toes about new ways that I need to think about data. I was recently in a conversation with healthcare practitioners and came up with this concept of what does values-based data look like? We often talk about values that go with companies, but what is values-based data? The conversation we were having on AI products that affect the justice impacted. And this particular person who works in the community said, I probably know more about what people need to see in data sets, primarily because I was incarcerated, and two, I know a lot of people who have those same types of concerns and considerations. There's this conversation we need to start having around data infrastructure and how we embed the values that companies like Intuit or Salesforce have into the data in which we train our models on. I think that would actually do a hell of a difference in thinking about the ways in which we create more trust. When people see themselves represented in the data, when we make less mistakes, when we contribute to high consequence outputs, you actually build trust, right? I don't know about you, I'm from New York. I don't trust anybody, right? It's just the nature of where I grew up. You know, it takes me a minute to warm up to you. People who know me quite well in this room know that's how I am, right? But once you get me and I really feel trustworthiness, which is different from trust, then I'm able to actually interact with you in a way that is much more confident, much more emboldening, much more, you know, of a feeling that I'm not going to be harmed. So I think enterprises really have to engage in this discussion. Who's around your table? What are your values? And then think about risk management from the standpoint of harm reduction. How are you also creating products that create harm reduction? Now, there's two ways to do that. I'll just go on what Liza said. First and foremost, you got to be compliant with laws. I mean, we're real clear that we're not going to get any AI legislation in this administration, clearly. But what we will get is probably a lot of people going to their attorney generals in their states suggesting that something went wrong. And so it's really important for us to think about how do we create models that actually reduce the harm, that are compliant with the existing statutory requirements, that if it smells like a skunk, it probably is a skunk and you need to move away because you have the right people at the table triggering what that might look like. I really am of the opinion that we as a society, there's this assumption that everybody's going to adopt AI just because it's available. I tell people there's enough AI for everybody to eat. I don't know, I grew up with the old school buffets. You could go down the line and eat any AI that you want. Healthcare AI, education AI, commerce AI. The question is, when you get down to the last piece of AI, are consumers just going to put it on their plate because it's available, or are they going to use it because it actually provides them a competitive advantage in the ways that they actually function in life and they improve their quality? For me, that is like the question of the 21st century, right? Not necessarily like Rebecca said, because I can be Debbie Downer sometimes. It's not about how do we remove the AI from the situation, but how do we get people to the good AI? And I think that's where I think the question needs to start, finding itself. What does that good AI look like? Because it has this ingredients that you're speaking about as well, Liza, that allow people to build and earn the trust and respect of that product.
Yeah, and that was exactly just all I was going to add.
I know, we're together. I've gone to Canada, so I became an official Canadian a couple of weeks ago.
I'm working, working all the angles. This was just exactly the point I wanted to make, which is that we have to talk about when AI works and when it works well and why it works well and what is successful about that. One of our partners, the BBC, just does this so well as a media organization, right? They're very, very good at using AI extremely effectively and right on the edge. Like they are themselves R&D leaders in terms of their use of the technology, and they are very good about how helping their viewership, both within the UK and internationally, to really understand how AI is being used. And then, of course, that gets translated into this really effective verify segment that I'm sure you've all seen, where they almost do like an NCI, detective episode with their viewership, going through how they were able to trust whatever piece of video content or otherwise they did. So really using that in-depth way to talk about all the great ways in which AI is being used, but why? What is it that makes it so effective in this moment?
David, can I just add on to that? Messaging. I had one other point to your point about messaging. So I brought up the statistic about the report that we did and we released today. The reason we released that report is because over 400,000 Black women have been displaced from the workforce. So it's a reality of statistical measure that has never happened before. And so I was sitting down with folks and I said, okay, could AI actually help with workforce placement? Are there ways that they could actually use tools that can, connect them to entrepreneurship opportunities? And I think those are conversations that get to what you're talking about, Rebecca. The challenge is most companies message to themselves, and they don't necessarily message to consumers that are the ones that are going to adopt the tools. And so how do you change that pitch in many respects, which is I think some of the things we'll do today, that allow people to know that this is a tool that actually will support me and will not harm my intended expectations or goals.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. I think we all hear more about the downside, and that I think also leads to potential distrust. And so what are the opportunities to highlight and shine a light on the great uses that can help people would be a great thing to do, not just from companies, but from communities, exactly. Because there is that tremendous benefit, and it doesn't get talked about enough.
And I think this all fits. There's a theme that's appearing over and over. I mean, I'm thinking back here to Kathy's initial remarks about trusted AI. That's not in tension with effective. Right? That's actually how you get to be trusted, is that you are effective. And so there's a strong overlap. I think, sometimes people say, well, responsible AI is this special thing. I'm like, no, you've just done a good job with it. But a challenge that I think arises for this, and Rebecca here, I want to pitch this to you initially, but I'm sure that both Liza and Nicol will have thoughts on this, is increasingly, a lot of the conversation just now almost is premised on this idea of there's a company, they create the AI, they work with the people, they deploy it, they collect the data. But of course, that's not how it works. I mean, nowadays there will be a dozen companies that have their fingers somewhere along the AI value chain, oftentimes more than a dozen. So how do we think about these things of trust and responsibility when I might be, at the very end of the value chain, of the supply chain, and I don't necessarily know, because not every company has the transparency principles that Liza was talking about. I don't always know what happened upstream of me. Or I'm upstream, I don't know what they're going to do downstream of me. How do we think about trust and responsibility in this networked, interconnected world where every AI is the product of many, many hands, not just one?
Well, I think this is what we need to get to, and I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because it does also come back to the point you were making about trust in a competitive landscape, because we now have these deeply complex, interwoven value chains and supply chains when we think about AI, all of the different aspects of AI development through and compute and data development and curation through to actual application and deployment. And those are both partners in a supply chain and competitors in applications or other areas, right? And so this question about how we need to identify the points of risk and the points of intervention across the value chain, I think that is one of the most fundamentally important questions that we as an ecosystem need to answer and explore and start to call out and better identify who are the key actors. Because right now, there is really that is not well understood. And we will not get to those good applications if we don't create trust across the value chain, right? And it comes out in our conversations about liability, but it also comes out in our conversations about customer satisfaction and rigor and quality of the products as well. So one of the topics that we're going to be talking about, and we've been working with you on, but I'm become very passionate about, which is strange, is assurance. Not something that necessarily generates a lot of passion, but I think this is fundamentally important. When we are thinking about AI industrial policy, is the market for governance of these systems, and how and what do we need to stand up in that regard to give the companies that are acting in the space the assurance that they can actively deploy these systems and be able to do so with the trust and quality and brand and reputation that they have.
So Rebecca just walked me into this conversation I've been having in my head, though, about internet industrial policy, right? Because this is where I think the whole governance question becomes really complicated, because AI doesn't really present a very clear pathway of what impact is going to have an industrial policy going forward. I find myself in these rooms with CEOs who cannot really tell me how many jobs are going to be disrupted in their company, or people who really don't know if their job is going to last, even though the robot still needs somebody to turn them on in the morning and fleet and service them, right? That conversation that Rebecca has is a conversation I think that many folks need to lean in. And that's what policymakers like myself, Lillian, and others, we sort of want to have this conversation, right, as to where AI fits in the broader ecosystem. Because to your point, David, there's so much conversation on AI. It always starts little, then it goes big, and then it goes the opposite way. And we never come up with real solutions on how we actually govern and bring oversight to a technology that really has not clearly defined its space in internet policy. And what I mean by that is, we knew when the internet came that it was going to disrupt a certain number of jobs in automation and manufacturing. We had a sense that, when we were able to get more kids online, that it was going to bring some value to the pedagogies and the ways in which we taught. AI, across the board, is a general purpose technology. It actually affects everything from the type of black shoes and tweed jackets I buy, all the way to the healthcare decisions that I have. And so I think one of the things I think is really important is that we begin to, I hate to say this, please, nobody from PETA kill me. You got to cut the elephant in small slices, right? Because right now, we're all trying to take on the bigger totality of the upstream and downstream effects without really thinking about where AI fits in the larger stream of stuff. I had an experience, actually, Liza, to speak to some folks from Intuit not too long ago. And I found it interesting, the values-based proposition that the company has and how it sticks to that proposition, because the AI, from what I understand, is used in some instances to help entrepreneurs with back office stuff. And so it allows them to stick to prosperity because the AI is enabled so that they don't have to hire a bookkeeper and they don't have to keep a close watch on that aspect of their job. To me, that's a introduction and sort of a visioning of what we should be talking about as industrial policy manifests in this space. So I agree with Rebecca. There are some things that we can do to make the ecosystem easier to navigate, but policymakers and academics have to have this broader conversation because we're not being quite helpful, in some instances.
Well, some of us are trying.
Some of us are trying, right, exactly, to actually get to this, because the way that AI is diffused is so dispersed in ways that we really can't connect the dots in ways that make sense. And our eyes on the prize should always be on people. In my work as well, I tell people, as much compute power as we put out there in terms of AI systems, we still haven't solved basic connectivity challenges. So there will be another chasm that results because people will be left behind in this, which then reorders our economic systems, particularly if we're trying to use AI for efficiency. So I don't know that that answers your question in totality. It's what keeps me up at night in a conversation I'd like to continue. But I think it's one that enterprises need to get involved with as you start to think about, how is this shifting my industry? How is it contributing to my growth? Where will there be an influx point where I actually have to reconsider the use of AI? Who am I speaking to, right? And what am I trying to do to also engage in harm reduction around these populations?
And I mean, Liza, as the representative of enterprise thinking here, how do you at Intuit, or more generally, think about your role within this broader supply value chain?
Well, so we are an innovator, and we do play an important role. And bringing experiences and being very customer and people obsessed is one of our values is around customers and obsession. And along with several others. And in terms of what we do is that, we always have the customer benefit and what we are trying to achieve to solve a customer's problem at heart. And that is what drives our decisions, our values, our customers around these areas. And I think in terms of the value chain, what would be really helpful is because we work with other parties in the ecosystem, and it would be helpful for there to be some types of best practices or frameworks that folks would adopt and use and be transparent about. That would actually help provide us with more confidence in those parties. It would provide it would make those parties more competitive potentially. But it would also, having transparency around that would just really help everybody in the entire ecosystem. And there isn't that today. So obviously there are a lot of enterprises that want to be responsible, have values, are trying to do the right thing, deliver amazing experiences that will help change their customers' lives, but not everybody. And it would be helpful to have that kind of framework to drive those best practices so that we could all, hold them up to what others are doing and know whether those are parties that you want to work with.
Yeah, I think that oh, I'm sorry.
I just said cool.
Oh, cool. I guess one question I want to toss out to all three of you. I think there is going to be some time for questions from the audience, but I want to drop a question that is a full hour conversation at least, if not more. But I'm going to ask if people can sort of give a succinct view. We don't just think about building trust, we also have to think about rebuilding trust. And that goes to questions of accountability, recourse. What do you do when things go wrong? And especially, say, I think, Nicol, you'd have something to say about what do you do when things go wrong and the person perceives it as having been because of something about them? Things happen, but if you think it was because of you or something about you, then that's a whole different game when it comes to trust and rebuilding it. So maybe take just a few seconds, minutes to talk about, and we can start, Liza, with you in terms of thinking through issues of recourse, accountability, rebuilding of trust when something goes awry.
So I mean, I think when anything goes awry, you need to figure out what it is and make it right, and rebuild trust. So trust is through actions, and it's through not just your intent, but also actions, and it's earned over time. And so, when companies are, I think, and enterprises are trusted, there's a little bit of currency there. And when you're transparent and work to make things, to fix issues and learn together and evolve, I think that is what you can do to rebuild trust when things don't work out exactly as planned.
So there's a saying that I adhere to, that it takes decades to build a reputation and 30 seconds to build it, to take it down, right? And so rebuilding trust is hard, right? Because people, particularly in this generation, look at things in the moment and they want that confidence at that moment. And now we have the internet and reviews and all these other things that we can do to sort of make it harder to rebuild trust. What I would say, most importantly, this is where policymaking comes into play. I think it's important for policymakers to bring some certainty with regards to just whatever accountability or oversight is needed to make sure the companies are playing by the same playbook. Right now, people are playing by different playbooks, and it makes it very difficult to sort of mitigate risk, particularly for as the AI becomes much more autonomous. So I do think policy has to come into play so that people can be trustworthy of the technology. And I would just say this last, I have been saying lately, I said this on a hearing, that I don't think that innovation and regulation actually are against each other. I think they're actually quite complementary. What I think is policymakers need to stay on the regulation side and regulate what they know, which is consumer protection. I really think policymakers try to get so deep into the black box it ends up with us not doing anything, which I think, again, without that uncertainty, it makes it harder for consumers to know where to go. I also think that, and some people may disagree with me, I'll just say this in terms of trustworthy, as a person who came from Washington, D.C., I do want to talk about policy in a civil manner here, is that it's important that states have some leeway to regulate. I know that we don't want this patchwork of new laws, and we fought really hard to have this administration have moratoriums, but states are actually doing really neat things because grandmothers are calling state AGs. They're not calling the congressman or the congresswoman. They want answers from somebody who's close to them, who understands their need, who needs to help them to wipe out a failure, who didn't, who might give them advice that you may not want to use this type of AI. So I do think states are going to be sort of the seed bed for where we see different type of regulatory frameworks emerge on the consumer protection side, and in some cases on sides which might be areas in which federal legislators might not have thought of. So I do think that provides certainty. When you know that your rights are protected in some way or form, you can rebuild trust.
Trust is a journey, not a destination. We all have to wake up every morning, I certainly do, thinking, how am I going to earn the trust of the people I serve inside the organization, I serve outside the organization. We've done a lot of work this year on post-deployment monitoring. We did a lot of work, remember, as a community on pre-deployment, building all those guardrails and guidelines and infrastructure in place. But it's when these systems are out in the world that we need to be attending to, are they continuing to be trustworthy? What has changed about the dynamics? So how do we continue to earn trust every day?
I'm getting a look. So with that, I think I'd like to thank my co-panelists and invite the audience. Please help me thank them for these tremendous insights.
And thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Happy to do it. Oh, we do have time for questions. Oh, wow. Okay. So we do have time for questions. I apologize. I thought the look was, oh, you guys ran over. You need to not do this. So I think there are some mics in the audience. Yes, please.
To be really loud. Thanks so much for this conversation, and I really appreciated the point about values-based data set. And I was curious if there are any concrete steps or actions that are being taken to build those, because by definition, those data sets don't exist. And the current data sets are excluding everybody that we want to be including. So I'm curious if there's any concreteness that's being thought of.
So that was a concept I came up with in the shower after that conversation. Somebody said your idea. I was listening to John Grisham on TV today. He said, I always have a story that I'm writing. I just think about it in the shower and I write it down. So that conversation, I think, is something that I'll definitely talk to Rebecca about at Brookings. It's been interesting to me that we've interacted with a lot of entrepreneurs and startups that are actually going deeper on micro language models versus large language models, which I think is sort of a precursor to what might actually happen in the marketplace going forward, where if someone wants health data that's looking at chronic disease, that their ability to not only find people with those particular conditions, but to also do it in a way where they're asking these wraparound questions that respect the subject or value their input or intrude at times of illness and when they're well. To me, those are some of the benchmarks of what should go into values-based data. It also assumes that the data sets that we have, may have blind spots in it that need to be filled. And so I have some concerns around, just doing that through regulatory sandboxes or safe harbors. I think that we could actually develop a framework that could be introduced into enterprises. That's just one way of thinking about this. And I want to also suggest that there are some companies that do this because you're regulated in some instances and you think about that from the start just because the regulators are making you think about your quantitative modeling in that way. So happy to follow up, and Rebecca, we can talk more about it as well.
And if I can just quickly, I would just say, actually, I think we've got lots of values-based data sets. I think every data set is values-based and is encoding the values by the ways we measure, by who's included. We're already doing it. We're just doing it without thinking. We're doing it because, well, that's what we've always done. We're doing it because it's convenient. And here, I think there is actually a very long tradition, multiple decades, of people thinking about how do we measure the world? And how should we measure the world? And how are values getting baked into those measurements and who we measure? That I think could bring a lot of insights if they're translated into explicit practices. It's a lot of critique right now and not necessarily what should we be doing instead, even though values are impacting what we're collecting in data. We just don't talk that way often.
Although, David, I would add, I agree with you. There is a lot of values-based data, but I have found among different sectors that those values do not necessarily reflect the lived experiences of the subject.
Oh, exactly. For the most part, the values are not the ones we want.
Saying, I don't know what values-based data you looked at lately, but some of them I look at.
They're bad values. But bad values are still values, right?
They are.
Hi, I have a question, and I was told to introduce myself. My name is Irina Raiko. I'm from the Markula Center for Applied Ethics. And since we're talking about trustworthiness, one spot at which that gets lost is in the marketing. So it's not the technology, whether it works or not. It's not the governance of the entire, organization. At what point do we start talking about RAIM, responsible AI marketing, that actually discloses limitations and doesn't give us all the hype? And so lessons that distrust that builds when people try to use them and find that they don't work the way they expected.
So I'll just write about it. I'll tell you about it as a researcher. So I was fascinated for a very long time with the Energy Star rating label because my dishwasher broke a few years ago and I had to go buy a new one. And I love the fact that I only went to the ones with big yellow label because that actually comes through coordination among industry and consumer groups. It tells you how much electricity, how much water, how durable the plastic is. It's basically a seal of approval on that actual device. We've had various conversations on how do you actually publicly present AI products to the community. Labels are one. There's a conversation floating around on the Bay Area in particular around putting together labels that would tell you, going back to the values-based question, what data this was trained on, how efficient it is it optimized, et cetera. I mean, I do think there has to be some level of disclosure. Some would disagree with me. I don't know what that looks like, which is why we're on this journey to find the good AI, because you do have to message that AI to people who may not know all the products and services that enterprises are doing. But you also have to have a feedback loop. So even if that dishwasher has that yellow label, I still want somebody to talk to if it still doesn't work well. Or I'm still going to need some type of warranty to ensure that if it breaks in the next 90 days, I can get another one. We haven't really dealt too much on the side that you're talking about. And I think it's an interesting conversation that this group should explore as you have more conversation today into the future of what does that toolkit look like? Because I think it's not something that policymakers are necessarily going to lean into outside of the accountability metrics.
Yeah, I would be happy to add to that. I totally agree. It's definitely an area to explore, and I think under the umbrella of transparency, it really needs to be context specific, and it needs to take into account who is the audience for that. And so that is something to definitely explore, is how to bring the right level of the right information to the right people. So is it the consumer who is the end user? Is it the enterprise adopting some third party? Is it like what is the message, and figuring out the best way to bring that information to the right people is absolutely something that we should all be exploring together.
And just a word of sympathy for marketers in the AI space. I think it is particularly challenging to be a responsible marketer in the AI space because of the overwhelming narratives of AI in the broader community, and the way in which it has, it's just bound up in all sorts of, whether it's geopolitics or whether it's AGI and, or whether it's, the capital markets or other. But there's a very strong media attention and narrative that is that frames this out. So even if you are the most responsible marketer, you're dealing with an audience that has a whole set of preconceived notions and that they bring to the work they're doing. So it is challenging, I think, and really crucially important.
Well, thank you again to the panelists, and I think this was a wonderful start to the day. Obviously, a whole lot more conversations over the upcoming, we've got another 7.5 hours maybe of this, so thank you again.